Cyprus is a small island country in the eastern Mediterranean, with an area of about 9.2 thousand square kilometers and a population of approximately 1.2 million people. In terms of size, this is comparable to the territory of Kyiv, along with its suburban area. Despite its compact size, Cyprus has a complex political history and a developed legal system. Located at the crossroads of three continents, it has been sought after by empires for centuries, each striving to gain control over its strategic position and resources. It all started with copper. It made Cyprus a tempting prize for the Mycenaeans and the Romans. Then new rulers arrived: the Byzantine Empire, the Venetian Republic, and the Ottoman Empire. Each of them included the island in their trade routes, military strategies, and major geopolitical chess games. Modern Cyprus was born under the flag of the British Empire. Since 1878, London ruled the island in a cold and pragmatic manner. The irony is that the imperial strategy aimed at control left behind the tools for financial takeoff: English law, corporate culture, accounting discipline, and generations of English-speaking lawyers and financiers. The colonial legacy became the foundation for the future offshore phenomenon. Greece and Cyprus are similar countries, different sides of the same coin. They share Greek culture and the Greek language. In both places, the majority of the population are ethnic Greeks who follow Orthodoxy. But economically, they are opposites. In 1975, the real GDP, Cyprus's GDP per capita, was more than twice as low as that of Greece, $6,173 versus $13,248 at that time. Greece was experiencing an economic miracle, but later, due to the populism of politicians and the paternalism of the population, it went into decline. We made a separate video about this. Today, Cyprus is already far ahead of its older brother. As of 2024, Cyprus's real GDP per capita is 52% higher than that of Greece. Today, the Republic of Cyprus is a financial hub of Europe, where money moves faster than tourists. And beneath the shine of the banking facades, a conflict smolders that has split the island in half and keeps it in constant tension with its neighbor. In this video, we will explore how an island that for centuries was a target of conquest has turned into a financial hub for global capital, balancing between regulatory attractiveness and reputational risks. The strategic importance of Cyprus is determined primarily by its geography. Located at the maritime crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, it was a natural stop for trade routes and an important naval base for any state with regional ambitions. This strategic value was enhanced by the island's immense natural wealth in copper. The very name of the island comes from the ancient Greek word for copper, Kypros. For centuries, the island was the largest and most famous source of this metal in the Mediterranean. As early as around 2300 BC, Cypriots began to exploit the vast deposits in the Troodos Mountains on an industrial scale, sending ore and finished metal products all over the world. In the late Bronze Age, around 1650 BC, the island was thriving. Known in contemporary texts as Alashia, it became a bustling international trading center. The island's economic appeal attracted waves of settlers, among whom the most important were the Mycenaean and Achaean Greeks after 1400 BC. They brought the Greek language, religion, and culture to the island, which over time became so deeply rooted that they formed the foundation of Cyprus's identity. Its strategic location left the island with almost no chance for long-term independence. The Empire of Alexander the Great, the Kingdom of Egypt during the Ptolemaic period, the Roman and Byzantine empires, the Venetian Republic, the Ottoman Empire. From the 4th century BC and practically until 1878, the island remained under foreign rule. Each of these states not only used its position and dominance, but also left its mark on the island's modern identity. Friends, we have an ambitious goal: to reach 200,000 subscribers on the channel by the end of 2026. You might be watching us for a long time and not even realize that you haven't subscribed. Subscribe to our channel and tell your relatives and friends about it. And also, give us a like and leave a comment below this video. We thank all donors, patrons, and sponsors on YouTube. Every contribution you make brings economic prosperity and well-being closer to Ukraine. After all, we are not just making videos, but enlightening voters who will choose real reformers. Help us with this. The link to support the price of the state is in the description. In 1878, the geopolitical great game between the British and Russian empires for influence led to Cyprus coming under the control of London. According to the secret Cyprus Convention of 1878, Britain took over the administration of the island in exchange for guarantees to protect the Ottoman Sultan's territories from Russian aggression. For British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Cyprus was a strategic asset, a place to station troops in the eastern Mediterranean to counter the Russian Empire, and even more importantly, to protect the sea route to India through the newly opened Suez Canal. At first, the island was a British protectorate under the nominal sovereignty of the Turks. But in 1914, when the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers in World War I, the island was unilaterally annexed by Great Britain. Istanbul officially renounced its claims in the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, and in 1925, Cyprus was officially declared a crown colony. The British established a colonial administration modeled after their own, introducing a structured civil service, a judicial system, and a more efficient tax collection system. Although at first, development was hampered because London considered Cyprus an insignificant possession. Nevertheless, the colonial government invested in the road network, improved port facilities, and in 1905 opened the Cyprus Government Railway, which connected the port of Famagusta with the mining regions. At the same time, the British administration achieved significant results in developing areas that had long been neglected under the rule of the Ottoman Empire: healthcare, the education system, and sanitary infrastructure. A network of hospitals and schools was established, basic public hygiene standards were introduced, and urban administration was modernized, which gradually improved the standard of living for the island's population. The most profound legacy of British rule was the legal system. The colonial administration replaced the Ottoman legal codes with British ones, introducing English common law, which still remains the foundation of Cypriot law, especially in the areas of contracts, commercial transactions, and criminal justice. The key difference between the two traditions is that common law develops mainly through judicial precedents. Court decisions shape legal norms and are binding for lower courts. Continental law, on the other hand, relies on detailed codified statutes, and the court applies them without creating new law through its decisions, but primarily applies pre-existing laws. After independence in 1960, Cyprus's public and administrative law developed under strong influence from Greek and French legal traditions, creating a unique hybrid system. Private law is English, public law is continental. In the future, accession to the EU in 2004 will add a third layer, as EU law will take precedence over national law. The implementation of British legislation on companies, partnerships, and contracts created a stable, predictable, and most importantly, familiar legal environment for international business and finance. Alongside legal reforms, there was a transformation of financial practices. The British administration introduced modern standards of accounting systems, bookkeeping, and auditing for government operations, replacing the Ottoman Murdaban system, which was based on traditional registers and customary practices. with a full-fledged accounting system. The introduction of British corporate law brought with it requirements for implementing accounting and financial reporting, which created a demand for new professional skills. While building the institutional structure of the state, the British simultaneously contributed to deepening the divide between communities. The Greek majority of Cyprus's population, who initially welcomed the British in the hope that they would support enosis, the union with Greece, soon realized that the new rulers were an obstacle to this. The demand for enosis became the central theme of Greek politics in Cyprus, expressed through petitions, demonstrations, and ultimately, violence. The nationalist demands for the union of Cyprus with Greece gradually caused increasing concern among the Turkish Cypriot community. Fearing that the implementation of the enosis idea would lead to their political oppression and marginalization, its leaders began to promote an alternative concept called taksim, the division of the island between the Greek and Turkish communities. In this tense environment, the colonial policy of the British Empire often only deepened the divide between the communities. London insisted that the right to self-determination should take into account the interests of the Turkish Cypriot community. Formally, this appeared to be the protection of a minority, but in reality, it entrenched their resistance to the idea of enosis and intensified the political division between the two communities of the island. Tensions reached their peak in the 1950s, and from 1955 to 1959, the Greek Cypriot Nationalist Organization, the National Organization of Cypriot Fighters, waged a guerrilla war to drive out the British and achieve enosis. The conflict was brutal, claiming the lives of British servicemen as well as Greek and Turkish Cypriots, and led to the first significant cases of intercommunal violence and population displacement. By the late 1950s, the situation had reached a political deadlock. Britain, weary of the uprising, was looking for a way out. Greece realized that Turkey would never allow unification. Turkey established itself as an indispensable party to any solution. A compromise was reached through a system of so-called guarantor states. The Zurich and London agreements of 1959 laid the foundations for an independent Cypriot state, excluding both enosis and taksim. On August 16, 1960, the British flag was officially lowered and the Republic of Cyprus appeared on the political map. Formally, it was an independent, bi-communal state built on a balance between the Greek and Turkish communities. The very structure of this statehood contained internal contradictions from the very beginning, which later turned into a deep and prolonged conflict. The 1960s Constitution was considered one of the most complex in the world. Its cumbersome structure reflected the main problem of the new state: a deep mistrust between the Greek Cypriot majority, which made up about 78% of the population, and the Turkish Cypriot minority, which accounted for approximately 18%. It established a bi-communal republic with a carefully designed system of power sharing. A Greek Cypriot held the position of president, while a Turkish Cypriot was the vice president, and each of them had the right to veto key decisions in the areas of foreign policy, defense, and security. The constitutional model also established a strict system of ethnic quotas in the state institutions of the Republic of Cyprus. In the public sector, the ratio of positions was determined by a 70-30 formula, and in the army, it was 60-40. Such a system provided the Turkish Cypriot community with much broader representation than their share of the population warranted, which was supposed to serve as a safeguard against majority domination, but at the same time created additional political tensions. In addition, the sovereignty of the new state was partially limited by international agreements. The 1960 Treaty of Guarantee gave the three guarantor states, Great Britain, Greece, and Turkey, the right to intervene in case of a threat to the constitutional order. In fact, this meant that the stability of Cyprus's political system depended not only on the internal balance between communities, but also on the positions of external partners. This delicate state system began to collapse almost immediately. The leadership of the Greek Cypriots, headed by President Archbishop Makarios III, considered the Turkish Cypriots' right of veto and disproportionate representation as obstacles to effective governance and majority rule. The leadership of the Turkish Cypriots, headed by First Vice President Fazil Küçük, regarded these same provisions as necessary safeguards against majority domination. A series of constitutional deadlocks on issues such as separate municipalities and taxation gradually paralyzed the government. The events of 1963-1964 effectively put an end to the functioning of the bi-communal model of Cyprus. Against the backdrop of interethnic violence, Turkish Cypriot ministers, parliamentarians, and civil servants left government institutions, which de facto destroyed the mechanism of joint governance of the state. The United Nations intervened in the situation, and in 1964 launched a peacekeeping mission and established the so-called Green Line, a buffer zone that runs through the capital Nicosia and separates the two communities. For the next decade, Cyprus existed in a state of division. The republic was governed by a government made up exclusively of Greek Cypriots, while Turkish Cypriots managed their own enclaves independently, receiving economic and military support from Turkey. The status quo was disrupted in the summer of 1974. On July 15, the military junta that was ruling Greece at the time organized a coup d'etat on the island. The reason was the Athens regime's belief that President Archbishop Makarios III had effectively abandoned the idea of enosis, that is, the unification of Cyprus with Greece. Under the leadership of Greek officers who commanded the Cypriot National Guard, the coup aimed to assassinate Makarios and install Nikos Samson, a former member of the Cypriot underground and an open supporter of enosis, as president. The political gamble of Athens instantly turned the island's internal crisis into an international conflict. Citing its rights under the treaty to protect Turkey, the Turkish community of Cyprus, and to restore constitutional order, on July 20, 1974, Turkey launched a military invasion under the code name Operation Attila. Turkish troops landed on the northern coast and quickly established a bridgehead around Kyrenia. The coup in Nicosia failed, as did the military junta in Athens. But after a brief ceasefire and unsuccessful peace talks in Geneva, the Turkish army launched a second, larger offensive operation. By the time the new ceasefire was declared, Turkish troops controlled about 37% of the island's territory, from Morphu in the west to Famagusta in the east. The invasion had catastrophic demographic consequences. It caused a massive and violent population exchange, which changed the ethnic map of the island. About 150,000 to 200,000 Greek Cypriots who lived in the north fled or were expelled to the south, becoming refugees in their own country. At the same time, about 43,000 or possibly even 60,000 Turkish Cypriots from the south moved to the north, to the territory controlled by Turkey. Within a few months after the events of 1974, mixed communities in Cyprus had practically disappeared. The mass movement of people divided the island into two ethnically homogeneous parts, separated by a buffer zone controlled by United Nations peacekeeping forces. The political division was officially established in the following years. In 1983, the territory occupied by Turkey unilaterally declared its independence as the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. To this day, it is recognized only by Turkey. The international community continues to recognize the Republic of Cyprus, which is now governed exclusively by Greek Cypriots, as the sole sovereign authority over the entire territory of the island. The division of 1974 created not just two new political entities, but separate and deeply unequal economic systems. The northern part of the island has existed from the very beginning under conditions of political and economic isolation. Lacking international recognition, it is subject to strict embargoes. Its ports and airports cannot legally handle direct international traffic. This means that all trade and travel must go through Turkey. The isolation has made the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus completely dependent on Ankara for economic aid, financial support, and military security. The adoption of the Turkish lira as its currency has further tied its economic fate to its patron, importing Turkey's inflation and currency instability. We have a separate video on our channel about the chronic problems of this state. How did Turkey lose control? Populism, corruption, and the flight of investors. After the events of 1974, the Republic of Cyprus found itself in a deep economic crisis. The government responded with a large-scale economic restructuring program. In the following years, the rapid recovery of the Greek part of the island began to be called the Cypriot economic miracle. From 1975 to 1978, the first and second emergency economic plans were introduced. The main task was to launch a housing program for refugees who were then living in temporary camps. Between 1975 and 1986, 12,500 low-income families received housing in social housing projects, which also included kindergartens, schools, and community centers. About 10,500 houses were built on private plots and 11,000 on state-owned land. At the same time, the government began actively supporting the economy by increasing public spending and implementing a loose monetary policy to finance the needs of refugees and the country's recovery after the 1974 crisis. An important step was the creation of a special financing fund. The central bank provided commercial banks with low-cost funding on the condition that they would direct loans to key sectors: manufacturing, tourism, and agriculture. The results spoke for themselves. The economy grew by about 6% per year, and the unemployment rate dropped to around 2% in 1978. However, the increase in domestic consumption and the rise in oil prices led to the economy overheating. The inflation rate reached as high as 7.4% in 1978. The third plan of emergency economic measures, which covered the period from 1979 to 1981, aimed to counteract the overheating of the economy. The central bank set strict limits for the first time on the amount of credit that commercial banks could extend to the private sector. This was done to stop the excessive consumption of imported goods. Retail price inflation dropped from 13.5 in 1980 to 1.2 in 1986. Recognizing the loss of Kyrenia and Famagusta, the Cypriot Tourism Organization actively promoted itself. On the southern coast, building regulations were relaxed to encourage hotel construction in Limassol, Paphos, and Ayia Napa, which was still a small fishing village at the time. By 1985, the number of tourists arriving in the south exceeded the total number who visited the entire island before the invasion. Their number grew from 165,000 in 1976 to 1,376,000 in 1989. This shift to the service sector laid the foundation for the country's further development. However, at the same time, it led to active coastal development and increased human pressure on coastal ecosystems. An unexpected catalyst was the outbreak of the civil war in Lebanon in 1975. The conflict, which lasted for 15 years, forced tens of thousands of wealthy Lebanese and Lebanese businesses to seek refuge in neighboring Cyprus, bringing with them much-needed capital and commercial experience that contributed to the island's recovery. Around the same time, the markets of the wealthy Arab countries of the Persian Gulf opened up, where a large-scale construction boom began. This created new opportunities for Cypriot companies and workers. After the 1974 crisis, unemployment on the island rose sharply, and in 1975, it was about 16 to 17%. But within a few years, the situation improved. By 1977, the unemployment rate had dropped to 3.1%, and by 1980, it was around 2%. This was largely thanks to the fact that thousands of Cypriots were working abroad. The most famous example was the construction corporation Ioannou and Paraskivides. At its peak, it employed about 40,000 workers, and its operations were so extensive that they accounted for up to 27% of Cyprus's economic activity. Besides this company, other Cypriots were also actively working in the Middle Eastern market. Cypriot construction groups, including Kabarko Group, Leptos Group, and Lois Builders, participated in building infrastructure, residential complexes, and industrial facilities in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. Money transfers from workers abroad became important for the economy until the Gulf countries started restructuring their development plans and Cypriots began returning home en masse. In 2008, remittances amounted to $948.6 million, which was about 3.5% of GDP at that time. The export of agricultural products also received a significant boost. Cypriot exporters managed to sell significant volumes of fresh vegetables, citrus fruits, and potatoes by taking advantage of seasonal opportunities. The Persian Gulf countries were the main clients. These buyers even competed with the traditional main market in London, where more than 250,000 Cypriots lived. The so-called second miracle and the source of future crises was the transformation of Cyprus into an offshore financial center. This was not a random process, but a deliberate strategy aimed at taking advantage of the island's location and its legal heritage from the British Empire. In 1977, the Central Bank of Cyprus introduced a special status for international commercial companies. Such companies could operate from Cyprus, but not work in the domestic market, and all their transactions had to be conducted abroad. For such registration, the state granted them a preferential tax rate of only 4.25% on net profit. This step turned Cyprus into an international financial and offshore center, attracting foreign business and capital. As a result, a dual economy was formed: a regulated domestic economy with trade unions and standard taxation, and an offshore free market zone with minimal tax barriers for foreign capital. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Cyprus became one of the key destinations for moving capital out of the former Soviet republics, especially from Ukraine and Russia. For the new class of post-Soviet oligarchs and entrepreneurs, Cyprus offered an ideal combination of advantages: low taxes, a jurisdiction striving to join the EU with a stable legal system, and all of this just a few hours' flight away. The basis of these relations was the double taxation avoidance agreement between Cyprus and the USSR, signed in 1982, which remained in effect after the collapse of the Union in the new republics. In Ukraine, right up until 2012, the agreement was extremely beneficial since it provided for zero tax on dividends, interest, and royalties, which is a regular payment for the right to use someone else's asset, that were paid from Cyprus to Ukraine and vice versa. It was the same in the Russian Federation. This created the notorious phenomenon known as the Cyprus sandwich. The oligarch would set up a Cypriot holding company. It owned assets, metallurgical plants, and oil fields in Russia or Ukraine. The profit was paid out as dividends to Cyprus. It was taxed at almost zero rate, and then it was either reinvested in the oligarch's country as direct foreign investments. taking advantage of legal protection against forced property seizure, or it was transferred to other tax havens. Unlike, for example, Caribbean tax havens that offered only formal confidentiality, Cyprus offered real advantages. Its British legal system meant that disputes between shareholders could be heard in the courts of Nicosia under the principles of English common law, which was considered fair and incorruptible. A huge ecosystem of audit firms, law firms, and service providers rapidly developed in Nicosia and Limassol. By 2010, the professional services sector accounted for nearly 10% of GDP. Preparing for EU accession in 2004, Cyprus was forced to change its tax system. The previous model provided for a separate offshore regime. Foreign companies paid significantly lower taxes than local ones. Such a practice was considered discriminatory and contrary to EU rules. Therefore, in 2002, the government carried out a large-scale tax reform by setting a single corporate tax rate of 10%. Later, in 2003, it was raised to 12.5% for all companies, both residents and non-residents. For offshore companies, this meant an increase in the tax burden, while for many local companies, taxes decreased. The main effect of the reform was that Cyprus's financial sector gained legitimacy within the European Union. Foreign investors could now operate through a jurisdiction that fully complied with EU regulations, while still maintaining one of the lowest corporate tax rates in Europe. This made the island especially attractive for international business and financial flows. As a result, the inflow of foreign capital increased sharply. By 2012, the assets of Cyprus's banking system had reached approximately 120 billion euros, which was almost 8 times the country's annual GDP. It was this hypertrophied banking system that later became one of the key factors in the island's financial crisis. The enormous size of the banking sector and its deep interdependence with another troubled economy, Greece, created a systemic vulnerability that became painfully evident during the Eurozone's sovereign debt crisis. Cypriot banks, particularly Cyprus Popular Bank and Bank of Cyprus, actively expanded their operations in the Greek market. They held Greek government bonds worth 4.7 billion. When the EU restructured Greek debt in 2011, private creditors wrote off about 100 billion euros. The holders of Cypriot government bonds suffered losses. This led to a loss of approximately 3.5 billion euros from the balance sheets of Cypriot banks, an amount equivalent to 20% of the republic's GDP. The banking crisis quickly led to a loss of payments on government bonds. The state, which already had a significant budget deficit of 7% of GDP, lost access to international borrowing markets and was unable to stabilize the banking system on its own. The worsening situation was accompanied by a sharp downgrade of the government's credit rating to so-called junk status, which effectively closed off Cyprus's ability to borrow funds on international financial markets. Under these circumstances, the country was forced to seek external financial assistance. In March 2013, after lengthy and difficult negotiations, the government agreed to a financial support program worth 10 billion euros provided by the so-called Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Eurozone partners, particularly Germany, were unwilling to use taxpayers' money to bail out the banking system, a system that was widely perceived as a haven for laundering Russian money. On March 25, 2013, a final agreement was reached that introduced the first-ever Eurozone bail-in procedure, covering bank losses at the expense of large depositors rather than just public funds. Financial assistance was provided on unprecedented and controversial terms. The banking sector reform involved several radical steps. The liquidation of the country's second-largest bank, Laiki Bank. Deposits up to 100,000 euros, which were insured, were transferred to Bank of Cyprus. Instead, uninsured deposits over 100,000 euros were frozen and effectively written off, placing them in the so-called bad bank bail-in of Bank of Cyprus. To recapitalize the bank, the largest bank in the country, 47.5% of uninsured deposits were confiscated and converted into bank capital in the form of shares. Capital controls. To prevent a massive outflow of money, the government imposed strict restrictions. Cash withdrawals were limited to about 300 euros per day, and transfers of funds abroad were subject to review by a special committee. The restrictions were in place for almost 2 years. These measures led to a sharp economic downturn. GDP fell by 3.4% in 2012, then by 0.6%. In 2013, this plunged the country into a prolonged recession that lasted about 3 years. At the same time, they became a kind of shock therapy for cleaning up the financial system. As a result of the restructuring of the two largest banks, the total size of the banking sector was reduced by approximately 23.9 billion euros, which was about 147% of GDP. The banks completely got rid of Greek government bonds and loans issued in Greece. This eliminated the main source of toxic assets, which cost the system about 4.5 billion euros in direct losses. The banking sector was also placed under strict supervision by the European Central Bank. This blow was especially painful for foreign depositors, since before the crisis, Cyprus's banking system largely depended on external capital. Approximately 37% of all deposits belonged to foreigners, a significant portion of whom were from Russia. According to various estimates, Russian companies and private depositors held between 20 and 35 billion euros in Cypriot banks. That is why the write-off of large deposits in 2013 caused significant losses to Russian and post-Soviet businesses, which had actively used Cyprus as a key offshore financial jurisdiction over the previous 2 decades. One of the key tools for economic recovery was the Cypriot Investment Program, better known as the Golden Passport Scheme. It was established in 2007 during the presidency of Tassos Papadopoulos, and after the financial crisis of 2013, the government of Nikos Anastasiadis significantly simplified the conditions to attract foreign capital more quickly. In particular, the minimum investment required to obtain citizenship was set at 10 million euros. Along with it, the investor received the right to live, work, and do business freely in EU countries. The program was financially successful, bringing over 9 billion euros to the economy from 2013 to 2020. The capital was mainly invested in the construction of luxury residential complexes in Limassol. The cityscape changed, and now it resembled Dubai more than a Mediterranean city. The construction boom created jobs, as developers paid off old overdue loans, essentially acting as a private sector that supported the economy. This was reflected in the unemployment rate, which dropped from 16.3 in 2016 to 7.2 in 2019. However, the passport program quickly became the center of controversy and accusations of corruption. International attention to weak oversight and the granting of citizenship to politically exposed persons, that is, current and former government officials and their family members, as well as people with questionable reputations, intensified. The turning point came in 2020 when the Al Jazeera TV channel published the Cyprus Papers investigation. Based on leaked government documents and hidden video recordings, journalists showed how some high-ranking officials were willing to facilitate the acquisition of Cypriot citizenship by a person with a criminal background. At the center of the scandal was then Speaker of Parliament Dimitris Silouris, who was caught on video discussing the possibility of helping an investor with a criminal record bypass the rules of the Golden Passport program. The publication caused a loud international outcry. It led to the resignation of officials and sharp criticism from the European Union. Eventually, the government of Cyprus was forced to completely shut down the Golden Passport program in October 2020. A subsequent official investigation revealed that more than half of the 6,779 passports issued under the program were improperly granted. And since then, the government has begun the process of revoking the citizenship of hundreds of people. Despite predictions of a double-digit recession, Cyprus recovered with remarkable speed. It exited the bailout program in 2016, 3 years after the crisis. Several factors explain why Cyprus managed to recover so quickly. Labor force flexibility. The private sector agreed to immediate wage cuts in order to preserve jobs. According to the Cyprus Statistical Service, in 2013 and 2014, the average wage in the private sector fell by 10 to 15%. The legal framework for non-performing loans. Unlike Greece, which protected strategic defaulters, Cyprus, under pressure, revised its foreclosure laws, allowing banks to sell non-performing loans to third-party companies, clearing their balance sheets. In May 2016, the share of non-performing loans began to decrease. The share of non-performing loans in Cyprus's banking system had reached a historic high of 49%. As of December 2025, this level has indeed fallen to 1.6%. Now the economy of the Republic of Cyprus is strong. Its growth rate of 3.4 in 2025 significantly exceeds the Eurozone average, which is 0.9. In 2026, the budget surplus reached 3% of GDP, and the public debt decreased to 56.4% of GDP. This is a significant improvement compared to 2020, when the debt reached 113% of GDP, and the deficit was 5% of GDP. Thanks to the spread of renewable energy sources on the island and the stabilization of global commodity prices, inflation stands at 0.9% compared to 8.4% in 2022 and 1.8% in 2024. After the completion of the passport scheme, the focus shifted to the establishment of headquarters. The government offers a 50% income tax exemption to technology companies that relocate staff to Cyprus. This attracted companies from Israel, Lebanon, and Ukraine, creating a real technology cluster in Limassol. Although the economy is thriving, the Republic's institutional health shows signs of erosion. In the World Press Freedom Index, Cyprus dropped by 12 positions, from 65th in 2024 to 77th in 2025. A characteristic feature is the increase in the number of lawsuits used by law firms and politicians to suppress investigative journalists. The concentration of media ownership in the hands of business circles connected to the government is a structural weakness. Cypriot investigative journalists describe how major media groups in recent years have come under the control of businessmen whose activities are outside the media sector, particularly in banking, IT, and other industries. Such changes are causing concern. If a media owner is simultaneously dependent on other sectors or on the state, this can affect which topics are covered and how they are presented. The Economist Intelligence Unit classifies Cyprus as a flawed democracy, ranking it 40th out of 167 countries in the 2024 Democracy Index. There was a significant deterioration in the category of functioning of government, reflecting public frustration with corruption scandals.
Індекс верховенства прав.
This puts Cyprus in 30th place in 2025. This reflects the enduring strength of the judicial system inherited from Great Britain. The level of economic freedom in Cyprus is 74.1%. This makes its economy 18th in the 2026 Index of Economic Freedom and 12th among 44 countries in Europe. The island's economy is considered mostly free. On December 22, 2025, the Cyprus Parliament voted for a long-awaited comprehensive tax reform. Among the main changes are the increase of the corporate tax rate from 12.5% to 15%, as well as the introduction of tax benefits for families with children. In particular, parents can receive a tax deduction of 1,000 to 2,000 euros for each child if the annual family income does not exceed 200,000 euros. The benefits also apply to single-parent families and cases where only one parent has custody of the child. The deduction goes to the person who has custody, or to the parents when they have joint custody. At the same time, the issue of dividing responsibilities remains unresolved. In 2026, the United Nations continues its efforts to extend the mandate of the peacekeeping forces and attempts to resume negotiations amid tense relations with Turkey and the leaders of the self-proclaimed Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. The unresolved Cyprus issue is still considered a key long-term political risk, creating the potential for new tensions. And it complicates regional cooperation. Since the discovery of the Aphrodite field in 2011 and later the Glaucus and Calypso fields, Cyprus has been trying to monetize its exclusive economic zone, a maritime zone adjacent to the state's coast, within which it has exclusive rights to explore and use marine resources, including oil and gas extraction, exploration, and development of fields. Such licenses are held by major players like ExxonMobil, Eni, Total, and Qatar Energy. However, Turkey disputes these borders and claims part of the continental shelf that, according to Cyprus's laws, falls within its zone. The Republic of Cyprus is a testament to the power of adaptability. It has survived invasion, occupation, financial collapse, and reputational scandals. Each time, it emerged from these trials not only unscathed, but often richer. It has successfully managed to get rid of its toxic dependence on Russian deposits and the Golden Passport scheme, moving towards a more sustainable state model. The strategy of the Republic of Cyprus is to become the Singapore of the Mediterranean. A replaceable, service-oriented, Western-oriented center that is indispensable for trade and security in the region. From an economic point of view, this strategy works. The contrast with Greece's stagnation and Turkey's impoverishment prove the effectiveness of its flexible pro-business model. However, the erosion of press freedom and the constant shadow of corruption indicate that, although Cyprus has mastered the art of accumulating wealth, it still has yet to fully master responsible governance. Since the country is located near the unstable Middle East, its resilience will depend on maintaining a delicate balance between economic openness and geopolitical security. And what do you think? Is there a chance that Cyprus will ever become a unified state again? Share your thoughts in the comments. This video was made possible by Atlas Network support. The opinions of the authors of this video do not necessarily reflect those of Atlas Network.